Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar presentation, Trends in Patent Prosecution, Don't Get Left Behind. I'm Shelley Sombrios, Senior Business Development Manager here at LexisNexis Intellectual Property Solutions, and we have a really exciting and informative webinar planned for you today. But first, I'd like to cover a few things before we get started. During the webinar, please feel free to submit questions using the questions feature in the control panel. Also in the control panel, you will see a handout section. This is where you can access the webinar slides from today's presentation. Also, a follow-up email of the recording from today's presentation will be sent out to you later today. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. With us today, we have Roberta Young, a high technology IP counsel and litigator. Her practice is focused on helping cutting-edge technology companies from startups to multinational companies actively grow IP assets, acquire other companies, license new products, and protect IP assets. Roberta brings a unique perspective as one of the very few females with deep expertise and knowledge in engineering and high tech. She understands, describes, and advocates for cutting-edge innovations while navigating the legal nuances of a client's patent preparation, enforcement, IP management, and litigation. She's built more than 1,000+ patent portfolio, supported licensing revenues of $20+ million, and completed a $1 billion merger. Roberta is an industry expert and thought leader and was most recently published in IP Law 360 and IP Watchdog. Also joining us today, we have Aparna Nemlikar, a partner in Fox Rothschild's Pittsburgh office with more than a decade of experience as both inside and outside counsel. Trained in human genetics with advanced degree in microbiology and immunology, Aparna uses her knowledge to assist clients in identifying and protecting valuable innovations in the United States and around the world. Her work includes advising clients on maximizing the scope, term, and value of intellectual property, including developing product exclusivity strategies, strategic patent prosecution and counseling, due diligence, and transactional support for her clients in the pharmaceutical, biologic, nutraceutical, cosmetic, and medical device and other health and life sciences fields. In addition to those two experts, we also have our very own Megan McLaughlin, the Director of Patent Product Management at LexisNexis IP. After graduating from Harvard Law, she worked as a patent attorney at the law firm of Nutter, McClellan, and Fish. Her technical focus reached a variety of industries, including medical devices, the food industry, software, printers, and biotech. And last but certainly not least, we have Gene Quinn, the founder and CEO of IP Watchdog, Inc. He's a patent attorney and a leading commentator on patent law and innovation policy. Gene has twice been named one of the top 50 most influential people in IP by Managing IP magazine. He's also been recognized by IAM magazine as one of the top 300 IP strategists in the world. And in 2021, he was recognized by IAM in their inaugural Strategy 300 Global Leaders list. According to IAM magazine, Mr. Quinn, quote, has reshaped the IP debate in the United States in a way that has forced policymakers to carefully consider the macroeconomic effects of IP law and its potential to drive innovation and economic activity, end quote. Thank you again, everyone, for attending today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gene.
Great. Thanks a lot, Shelley, and thank you all for being here with us today. We have an interesting conversation, which is no doubt why we have over 900 registrants for this webinar today. I know some of you are probably all over the world, and some of you may be registering to watch this later. So we appreciate you joining us for wherever you may be. And we're going to get started right away. We have a lot of ground to cover. And as Shelley introduced us, you get a feel for, we all have different backgrounds. We all focus on different things. And that's intentional whenever we do a patent prosecution type webinar. We like to come at it from a variety of different angles to really give you an idea of what is really going on here. And today's discussion is going to be all about the trends in 101 and 112, which we could probably do an entire day or really an entire program on, several days. So we're going to try and fit as much as we can into this segment. Before we get going, and I turn it over to Megan to go through her research, which is going to seed the conversation before we get into examples that we want to cover. I'd like to open it up to the panel to get their preliminary thoughts on what it is that you want us to focus on as we jump into this wide-ranging topic. Roberta, let's start with you. On a big picture level, what would you like people to focus on as we begin this topic of trends in this wide open Wild West space?
What I think we need to remember is cases are still being allowed. It is possible to overcome these rejections, and there are some strategies that can be implemented first when you're drafting the case, and of course when you're prosecuting the case. These are not insurmountable barriers. There are strategies that anyone can approach and incorporate into how they draft patents that should result in a stronger patent.
Yeah, and that will be a recurring theme here. Aparna, one of the things we're going to be talking about, I think, is going to be just these what seem like overly long first office actions that make it seem like you have no hope and no chance. And but there is hope, and you do have a chance if you know what you're doing.
That's exactly right, Jean. And it's important when you get those long office actions is to take a step back, review the case law, and make sure that the examiner understands what you're really going after. So part of that is, as Roberta said, you got to go back to the specification that you drafted, go back to the claims, and see what you can do using the strategies we'll talk about here to try to get those claims allowed. But it is daunting when you first get that long office action. Yeah,
it's like, Megan, what have I done wrong? Am I in the right line of work? Sometimes it feels like. What are your initial thoughts here?
Yeah, so the data definitely indicates that the practice of patent law is getting a little bit more complex. But I think the other important thing to know, in addition to what Aparna and Roberta said, you can, there are ways to overcome these rejections. And like I always say, I think it's really important to know the examiner that you're working with, because as we'll see in the data, these trends vary by the type of examiner that you're up against. So it's really important to know who's on the other side of the negotiating table.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's all about negotiating to get, it's the name of the game. I suppose it's still not good to get a first office allowance, although it's better than getting a never office rejection, I suppose, the opposite end. But you still, at the end of the day, are going to wind up negotiating. So you gotta know who it is you're negotiating with and what you can reasonably get, and how you're going to get it. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So Megan, let's take a look at what the data is actually going to show us. And just to give folks a preview, it's probably going to take us about 10, maybe 15 minutes to get through. And then what we'll do is bring in Roberta, Aparna, and get their take on whether the data matches what they are seeing. And then we're going to go through some very specific examples and claims and to see what's going on in their practice space. So Megan, take it away.
Yep, so just quickly by way of background, it's almost impossible to talk about trends at the Patent Office without talking about the people at the Patent Office who are behind these trends. So at Patent Advisor, we have a way of measuring examiner behavior that we call ETA. It stands for Examiner Time Allocation, and you'll be seeing it in some of the following charts and graphs that I have about 101 and 112 trends. So at a high level, ETA is just the ratio of that examiner's office actions to their allowances. So when they come into work every day and they've got a docket of 10 cases sitting on their desk, how many of those cases are they writing rejections on, and how many are they granting allowances for? So a low ETA ratio means that examiner is fast, they're efficient, they're granting a lot of cases quickly. A high ETA is inefficient, slow to grant patents, issuing a lot of rejections. So in our system, we break it down by color. So green means fast or efficient, yellow is about average, and then red is slow or inefficient. And it kind of, if you look across the patent office, it looks a bit like a bell curve. So the small majority of examiners are yellow, and then you've got some on the left that are green and some on the right that are red. And Jean, if you click through, you'll see we started relying on ETA years ago because it has some benefits over allowance rate, which is what people typically use to measure examiner behavior. Namely, it includes data from pending applications. It accounts for how long the examiner's been at the office, and it's driven entirely by the examiner's own behavior. What are they doing? When they come into the office, are they writing office actions or are they writing allowances? So as we go through the data, this is when you see red, green, yellow, this is what we mean. Do we mean how quickly is the examiner granting patents versus rejecting them? So if you go to the next slide, I started this investigation on trends a while back because people kept coming to me and saying, I feel like there's more 112 rejections. I'm getting more 112 rejections. Did the patent office implement software to detect them? Because I feel like I'm getting more. So we did a bunch of research, and I know this looks kind of noisy, but really, if anything, the number of 112 rejections is slightly going down. I cut it off at March of 2020 because after that, you start having office actions that are private that I can't detect. But really, the overall number of rejections, at least, and right now we're looking in 1600, so kind of life sciences space, fairly constant. But then if you go to the next slide, here's the interesting story. Arguably, they're getting more complex. So yes, there might be the same number, but if you look at the number of pages in each office action over time, that's going up. And it's actually been creeping up at least as early as 2013. Although I suspect if I went back farther, I would see it going up even more. So the lines that you see there, these are office actions specifically that included a 112 rejection. So you can see that those are even tend to be longer than average. The bars, just to benchmark on either end, those are all office actions. So including 112 rejections and not including 112 rejections. And in both situations, the number of pages has been creeping up. I think the other interesting thing to note from this is that the creep is faster for red examiners than it is for yellow and than it is for green. So whatever trend is causing this, it's influencing a certain class of examiners at the patent office more than others. And remember, ETA is just how fast they operate. So there are red, yellow, and green examiners in every technology space at the patent office. Some technology spaces have more red, some have more green, but really they exist everywhere across the patent office. So no, you're not crazy if you feel like there's more 112 rejections. It's that there's more to the 112 rejections that you're getting, and frankly, more to the office actions overall that you're receiving. Mm-hmm. So sticking with this technology space, on the next slide, in 1600, we'll see 101 rejections over time, and again, the number, if anything, is slightly dropping. But very, fairly consistent. Now, I didn't do an analysis of the number of pages per office action specifically for 101 rejections, but like you saw from the slide before, the number of pages per office action overall is creeping up. So if we go to the next slide, I did this exact same analysis for 2100 for Roberta's technology space. 2100 is computer architecture and software, and it's where most artificial intelligence goes. Artificial intelligence can be anywhere these days, but the actual artificial intelligence art units are here. And again, with the 112 rejections, very steady here. Almost no changes over time. But then when we go to the next slide, we see an even more extreme increase in what I would consider complexity. And here also, I think what's interesting is, so not only is there just a stark increase from 2013 to today in the average number of pages, but look where that increase is coming from. It's coming almost entirely from red and yellow examiners, particularly red examiners. The green examiners haven't changed that much over time. Now, clearly what's driving the increase here is not just 112, also 101. I think we can say quite certainly in 2100 that that's also what's happening here. Although again, office actions that have a 112 rejection do tend to be longer than average across the board. So before we go on to the next slide, which shows 101 rejections, because that also has some oddities to it that we'll probably want to discuss. I'd be really interested to hear Roberta and Aparna's opinions about what might be driving this and whether this reflects your experience.
Yeah, and before we bring you guys in, Megan, maybe we should probably say that when we've talked to the patent office, we've interviewed Drew Hirschfeld, Commissioner for Patents, who's now continuing to act as the acting director, and he tells us for certain that there is no software involved in assisting examiners making 112 rejections. And I've known Drew for 15 plus years, so when Drew says something like that, I believe him. I don't think that he's not lying to me or anything like that. So I don't know what's going on, because I've also asked patent attorneys, like large groups of patent attorneys, how many of you believe the examiners read the specification? And no hands go up. But I think that's the only way you can make a 112 rejection, right? You have to know you're supposed to know what's in the specification. Yeah. So, Roberta, let's start with you. What so far, based on the data, does this match what you see or feel?
Yes, it matches both what I'm seeing and definitely what I'm feeling. Is that the 101 I half expect, because of the area where I'm in, this led the way for 101. Alice is famous for a reason, and not just thanks to Lewis Carroll. But what I'm seeing in 112s is they're often partnered with this approach, and it's almost like they're going to throw everything at you. They want to see what's going to stick. And once you get a few key phrases with the use of templates, it's easy to create a rejection and to make it look like there's more there. And that's why first thing I do is when I look at the page count, I take a deep breath and go, now what am I really facing? Mm-hmm. And above all, what is my mission to educate this examiner on what I'm really doing, what I'm advocating for?
Yeah. So Aparna, before I want to come back to the educating the examiner piece here in a minute, but I'd like to get your thoughts on the data. Is this what you feel is going on in your space, or are you seeing or feeling something different?
No, this is absolutely what we're seeing as well. And I think my viewpoint is that part of the reason is, I think, similar to what Roberta said, but what the examiner is doing is throwing everything at you. I see a lot of pages where they've copied case law, pieces of opinions into the office action, where they've just kind of cut and pasted right into the office action to try to make their point. The other thing I'm seeing is a lot more complexity in what they're trying to argue. Before, 112 rejections used to be like, you don't have antecedent basis, or it's not indefinite because the range isn't disclosed, or something to that effect, where you could address it pretty, straightforward. Now there's a lot more complexity with the enablement rejections, as well as, even written description. So from 112 perspective, it has gotten a lot more complex. And of course, 101 is a minefield.
Yeah. So with respect to teaching the examiners, and are the examiners willing to be taught? Because I wonder if an examiner is, because I wonder what's going on with these 112, and it seems to me that it's completely plausible that they are just throwing everything in there that they can think of, because there's always been this feeling that there's a lot of examiners who will do whatever they can to get the first office action off their desk, sometimes as quickly as they possibly can. And I do think a lot of these feel like they are maybe not as well thought out as they are lengthy. And if that's the examiner you're dealing with, is there really receptiveness to being educated as to what is being claimed, or what the invention really is? And how do you crack that nut if there isn't? Roberta?
Well,
thoughts?
what I see is oftentimes a reasonable examiner will, particularly, I'll often do a first office action interview so I can get a read on the examiner and see what their thought process is. And if they're asking more questions, if they're engaging with the material, then I believe I have a chance at educating and saying, well, this is where we're really focusing. This is what we're really directed to. And in contrast, I'm reminded of a saying that I grew up with, that the hardest thing to open is a closed mind. And there are examiners that do have that as a process, that
Yeah.
they will not be persuaded, even with an affidavit or a declaration from an inventor, they will not change their mind. And of course, that's why we have programs like appeals and the patent ombudsman, is to help get a fresh set of eyes on. But I often use a first office action interview to get a gauge for, is this someone with an open mind who's willing to take what I share with them and use that to filter what they need to do.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of interviews because I do think that they give you a lot of information. A partner, are they useful in the life sciences area like they might be in certain other areas? I mean, I
Yeah,
just
I
don't know.
absolutely believe in interviews as well. I think, after you get that first action, getting a level set and making sure that the examiner understands what you're trying to go after, understands the art that's out there, and what your specific contribution is, the technical advance that you're trying to go after. I think that's very important. I will say that examiners, I think a lot of examiners now are willing to negotiate with you. At least that's what I've found. They do understand that the case law out there is kind of a minefield, and there is a lot of it out there. I found that examiners are willing to educate. They do stick to the case law, and they do want to throw those rejections out there, for sure, but I think there are ways to navigate around that and work with the examiners.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get too sidetracked, because we could go on and on and on, but let's wrap up, Megan.
Yeah.
And the
Yes. So
is
one
there
other thing I
more?
want to say, oh,
Go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I didn't put a graph for the response, the number of pages and responses, but it's going up even more, by the way.
Yeah, no doubt.
So,
Well, I
so
mean,
I would
even,
assume
if examiners are going to start throwing case law at us, I mean, because
Yeah.
there has always been this understanding that you don't throw case law at an examiner, sort of period, right? And I say sort of because as you get longer in the case and you really are starting to get towards appealing, maybe you start preparing for the appeal and case law starts working its way in, and or at the very beginning after a very important new case comes out, the examiners aren't applying it, so you have to maybe feel like you put it in. But ordinarily you don't put it in. But if examiners are going to start throwing that stuff at us, then I think we have to deal with it that way, right?
yeah, I think that's right. But if you go to the last one, and I held this one for the last because I think this is good news. So if you look at the 101 trends in 2100, I quadruple checked this because I kept thinking, this is extreme. I must be missing something. So, and I remember my colleague Kate Gaudry published an article about this back in 2018 because she saw the number of 101 rejections just skyrocketing in the AI space. And
Yeah.
they really were. But then the 2019 guidance came along and it just went lower than the baseline. So these things.
Well, and then this becomes the issue, right, that we've talked about is you might be able to get a patent from the patent office, but are you going to be able to keep it from the federal circuit?
Yeah.
And then the other question is, Kathy Vidal's confirmation hearing is tomorrow, and what if anything is going to change once she becomes director? Now, and I don't know her as well as I have known a lot of others. I do know her a little bit, and I think she's going to be great. If she's allowed to be great. And so time is gonna tell. But
Yeah.
we'll see what happens here. We might wind up getting another another blip going higher here. But I also think that there's probably somewhat of a capitulation too. People are just not asking for the same bad claims. And by bad, I don't mean bad in that, claims that you shouldn't be allowed to get, but claims that, people wearing black robes aren't going to allow you to keep. I mean, do you see that in both of your spaces? Let's start with you, Roberta, where you're just not asking for the same claims, or if you are, they're in a different patent, maybe in a continuation, so that they don't contaminate other claims.
What I'm finding is that the basics of what I've always believed a patent should be is a focus on the technology and what clearly makes your technology different. With that in mind, having an extensive engineering background, I tend to first go with that. And what I'm finding is that claims that would have been allowed in a earlier time frame would certainly not pass muster now. We'll get a 101 and it'll be really tough to overcome because you need that rich technical detail in the specification to genuinely claim it. Where I think we tend to kind of see a warping effect is where what would normally be really a software program is being claimed as an improvement in processor speed, memory access speed, or even a user interface. So we're in effect looking for a backdoor in while still legitimately reflecting what's novel.
Yeah, and that's just I'm glad you brought that up in some respect. This is one of the greatest ironies in the computer space, this software area, is that that which makes it work is not patent eligible. That which makes it look interesting or cool is patent eligible and patentable. You can get a design patent on the graphic user interface. You can get a utility patent on the graphic user interface. But try and get a patent on the way your payment process works. No patent for you. And this just like, it's bizarro. It's like upside down. Why would you give a utility patent on the way something looks if you're going to prevent it on the way it works? And I just don't. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still asleep. I'm going to wake up at some point and and we're going to meet in real life because this is a nightmare. But Aparna, how does this manifest itself in the life sciences area?
Yes, absolutely. There's creative claiming in the life sciences as well. You can go after diagnostics again for 101 issues. So now we're seeing creeping in of different claim language such as treatment regimens, dosing, all of that in there as well. I think there's a lot more description that we need to put in the specification to avoid enablement issues, and people really have to think, broad genus claims are no longer the thing. So people have to kind of nest their claims, try to get the subject matter that really is the technical advance into the claims. And the broad genus claims are just going away now.
Yeah. And well, I'll throw this out there while we're kind of making a transition here. There was a case decided by the Federal Circuit. It was either today or yesterday in Milan and Biogen, and it seems to me that and it's relevant because it deals with the specification and a written description, and the district court judge totally misunderstood the difference between clinical efficacy and therapeutic efficacy, and that just permeated the entire decision. And Biogen kept filing papers to kind of educate the judge, and the judge just kept getting it wrong, and then finally the judge barred them from providing evidence on the difference as if they're the same thing. And the majority of the Federal Circuit said that there was no reversible error. And Judge O'Malley was like, look, I'm not usually one to reverse district courts where there's findings of fact, but this permeated the entire decision. They got it wrong from the get-go, and this aspect of the decision was wrong. So on one hand, we see at the patent office, it's all about the specification anymore. It seems you have to have so much in the specification. If you're getting 112 rejections, but it's this crazy world where there's this disconnect sometimes between what goes on at the patent office and what goes on at the federal circuit. And I don't know that I have any great analysis yet of that case. I want to bring it up for people because I think if you're in the life sciences area, you're going to definitely want to take a look at that case. I personally think you're going to see that rehearing, and I suspect that that's going to get reversed. And I also suspect that if that is going to get a rehearing and it's going to get rebriefed or anything, and your client has any kind of line item for the issues, you're probably going to want to file a brief in it, because I think that that's fundamentally wrong, that decision. And it affects so much, because the written description, correct me if I'm wrong, but the written description is supposed to be about the claimed invention, right? And what we're supposed to, so sometimes I wonder whether the science is just, and I mean, I don't even know whether I have a complete thought here, but maybe the question I have for both of you at the moment is, how do you capture the science and the technology in the written description to the point where it lives through the life of the application and beyond? Because it's got to live through the district court and through 20 years, right? Or plus or minus. I mean, what are the tips and tricks that you have for dealing with that, if you have any?
Well, I'll start and say, that is absolutely the conundrum that we face as we're drafting the application, is how to capture what they have now, but also consider how this is going to play out in the next 20 years and as the application is pending in front of the patent office. And some of the tips is, to have backups built in, have a diverse set of species, examples, consider prophetic examples, have ranges, just kind of bombard the application with built-in backups that you can rely on during prosecution, and make sure that you are considering the full scope of your claims as you're claiming it. And same thing goes during prosecution as well. As you're, prosecuting the application and arguing over prior art, you have to be really careful about how you discuss the art and what's routine, what's conventional, what is out there in the art, what would be obvious embodiment over or an alternative over what you've claimed.
Mm-hmm. Roberta, your thoughts on that? I mean,
I do have an approach for that, and maybe it's because I'm working in an area that has yielded a lot of very, very hot, very current things. But I actually have a segment in most of the specifications that I'm drafting, and I call it the Back to the Future segment, because I'm looking forward. What conceivably could we be using this technology in? A lot of the work that I've done in the mobile device space is now adapting into things like autonomous vehicles. So I take a look at, where could we possibly use this? What could we, possibly use this for? And have a brief discussion about it, and put a lot of what I call the technological meat of the details, that this detail could conceivably foster this, another detail could foster something else. So I do take those moments to look forward. What would we use this for? And think about it.
Yeah, I think that's so important and so necessary, particularly the way that the cases are developing, and particularly given the continuing need to have continuations, and the importance of having them as a part of a foundation to as a patent owner to combat IPRs and to continue to build out your portfolio and the like. But let's take a look, Aparna, if you will, at the table that you provided me with the comparison of the claims here. And that's what I'm showing folks now. And not all of them are gonna, not the full length of the claim is gonna wind up appearing on the screen here. We'll provide all of this to you in the email that Lexis will follow up with so that you'll have this full table here. But what do you want people to take a look at these claims for? What's the point, the teaching point here?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, and this is really interesting, is that, you know, what's happening in the life sciences with Section 101 is it is, you know, becoming a real issue here. And so even though you have method of treatment claims, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are Section 101 patent eligible. What really needs to happen is, you know, as you're drafting the claims, you need to take a look at what does that claim cover. If it's, you know, novel small molecule, you're fine, composition of matter. But if it's a method of treating using an existing thing, an existing composition, you really have to consider what is it that you're going after. The other thing is, of course, diagnostics in the life sciences have faced several setbacks and roadblocks thanks to Mayo. So I wanted to compare here the claims, representative claims that I've showed for Mayo and Vanda to start off with. Here, Mayo was found to be ineligible. However, the Federal Circuit found Vanda to have eligible claims, and of course, the cert was denied, indicating that the Supreme Court agreed with that decision. What really, as you review these claims, you'll see that these claims are so similar. You know, there's a method of optimizing therapeutic efficacy for treatment of a GI disorder. And then Vanda has a method of treating a patient who's suffering from schizophrenia. But what really is the difference is, you know, Mayo goes after administering 6-thioguanine into the patient and then determining the level, but then it talks about, you know, a high and low level. So what if the 6-thioguanine hits the lower threshold, then you need to increase the drug. But if you have a high, it meets the high threshold, then you need to decrease the drug, without having specifics as to what exactly that treatment should be. In contrast, Vanda is also talking about a method of treating, but it talks about the CYP2D6 poor metabolizer. So if the patient is a poor metabolizer of that, they would get the drug in an amount of up to 12. However, if they're not a poor metabolizer, it talks about that they would get an amount greater than 12 to up to 24. So these are very specific, treatment regimens that Vanda has put out there. So it's really interesting to see that what Vanda focused on was talking about a specific technical advance that they had over the prior art. So the other thing that was interesting is that comparison with Eno. Eno v. Praxair also was a method of treatment, but it was found to be ineligible because it was directed to a natural phenomenon, which was the inhalation of nitric oxide gas would induce an increase in the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, leading to pulmonary edema in neonatal patients with hypoxic respiratory failure. Here, that portion that I've highlighted there is the natural phenomenon, and how they determined. What they did was they determined if a patient had left ventricular dysfunction, and if the patient did, they would not administer the inhaled nitric oxide. If the patient didn't, they would administer this inhaled nitric oxide. The issue is that the inhaled nitric oxide was the therapeutic that was the conventional therapeutic. It was routine conventional therapeutic. And by saying that if you measured this, or if you determined that the patient does not have left ventricular dysfunction, you would just administer the routine treatment. However, if the patient does have left ventricular dysfunction, you would not administer the treatment, meaning that there is no treatment, there is no action taken at that point. So that difference did not show a specific technical advance over the prior art. It was basically an inaction. So I think what's really important between these three cases is to show that you should, when you're drafting method of treatment cases, including some sort of natural phenomenon in there, or measuring as something in a sample, or determining some sort of threshold, what you need to do is also include potentially treatment steps that are also meet the threshold of, an improvement over the prior art.
Yeah, so essentially this gets back to, in order to satisfy 101, you have to overcome 102.
Exactly. So 101 and 102, 103 are all kind of melding together. Have to have that inventive concept in there.
Right.
Well, and I have a question for you, Aparna. How much do you think the decision was influenced by that, failure to satisfy 102, and how much was it influenced by the fact that what was novel was not treating? Because to me, maybe that actually, maybe the right thing is to not treat, and maybe we should incentivize people to.
See, in Western medicine, that is pretty novel, right? Not treating.
It is. Back off.
Right. Yeah. And the fact, I think the court did focus on the fact that it was inaction, and it was just letting the course of nature take hold by not doing anything. There's no action in So that was kind of the distinction between those three cases. But yeah, Vanda is kind of showing us that, if you have that inventive concept in there, that the treatment itself, the treatment regimen, the dose that you're giving has to have that inventive concept.
So can I ask, and Roberta, I'd like to ask you this question too, just generically speaking, in order to overcome the hunt for the inventive concept threshold, is it enough to say in the specification or explain in the specification that there is something unique compared to the prior art, or is there actually a hunt for that being true? Because it strikes me that if you draft it properly and say and explain that there is that difference, that's all you really need to do at the 101 level. And then the reality of the situation, that starts to matter once we compare prior art under the 102 and 103 scenarios. Is that true, or is more required in order to overcome the 101 threshold?
I think more is required. And typically, one of the things I try to avoid is going into a discussion of the prior art in the application, because then it makes it easier for the examiner to come back with, I've handed the examiner a 102 or 103 rejection with admitted prior art, which I don't want to do.
Right.
What I typically focus on is the need for the invention. What drove the creation of the concept? What problem was the inventor researching? And looking at how they're addressing the problem, specifically those unique features that, drive a processor a certain way, use it a certain way, or map it, differently. And that's the focus that I have, without doing comparisons. And
right. Right. I wouldn't ever suggest doing a comparison, but like, is it enough? So, and I'm gonna need to use a computer example, Aparna, because I mean, my knowledge of life sciences is that it exists. And, but so is it enough, Roberta, to say that, this technique or so this method or technique makes storing and storing the data or retrieving the data from storage faster?
Yes, I think that can be if you back it up with specific techniques. And yes, some of the work that falls under the, improving the functioning of the computer, which
Right.
that would be allowed. And if you're pushing towards that direction, yeah, I've used that and very effectively.
And that still is okay today, you would think.
Yes.
Okay. So Aparna, so then the same sort of question to you, and I don't know that I'll be able to phrase it, so help me phrase it. What do you need to have in the specification in order to satisfy that hunt for the inventive concept prong of 101? Like, what hook do you need in the specification to say, oh no, see, it's right there, examiner. I do overcome that.
Yeah, and I think it's the fact that you're telling a story in the specification. I agree completely with Roberta when she said don't discuss the background
Right.
art, don't discuss previous things, but you can still tell a story of what is, what is the state of the law or the state of the art,
Mm-hmm.
and then talk about, what it is that you are bringing to the table by discussing, okay, we are measuring this. However, the treatment that is recommended will change because you're doing X instead of Y. That is typically the treatment that is given.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And because that's really, that's so critical. You can't discuss what the prior art is. Otherwise, you're going to run into just all the problems from KSR.
Yeah.
You're going to set up the examiner. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Jean. I was just going to mention the other thing that I wanted to point out in that chart, but you don't need to bring it up, is that, there's creative claiming going on, so you can't go after method of diagnostics. However, maybe you could go after a method of preparing a man-made labeled protein that you made that helped you diagnose. You could also talk about, different ways of going after, method of manufacture, method of preparation, dosage regimens, different ways to go after the same kinds of claims.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So looking at the time, we're into sort of the fourth quarter here of the program. So I want to make sure we get to Roberta is prepared a few slides for us here. And again, we don't have these loaded, but we'll make sure that you get the chart that Aparna created, as well as these slides that Roberta has created when Lexis sends you the email of this webinar. So Roberta, take it away, if you will.
Thank you, Jean. And let's go down to my example in the interest of time, which is found on slide 8, the example application, the continuation application. The parent application was filed way back in January of 2013. So that's pretty old when you talk about I'm arguing for this specification in 2021. The continuation that led to the 101 rejection, the continuation was filed in September of 2017. And I would note the specification does not reflect current drafting practice in this area. Computers are discussed largely at a high level. Processors, there's a little more detail. And the independent claims were directed to an electronic record information system that basically comprised a secure memory and a processor. And the processor was programmed to access multiple web services for secure data health records, such as health records, and look at across a landscape of different records. And the secure records pertain to individuals that are collected in the data pools that accessed the web services. And a target individual was grouped into population cohorts, and then ultimately a clinical condition was attributed based on the secure data records. Now, the examiner made a 101 that this was directed to methods of human activity. This was, could be performed mentally, and, basically what to do. So going on to the next slide, what I did there, clarify and simplify the claim language. It was convoluted as originally written. I was very concise, focusing on I'm drawing from at least one web service, accessing by at least, one element or segment of a processor. I focused specifically on the technical details where the processor had been programmed to operate in certain ways to access and key in on certain data within the data records. And then I also made a fairly extensive amendment that addressed the user interface where the mapping was related. And ultimately, you could look at a mapping of individuals within certain areas or certain population centers of the map would be more likely to suffer from a clinical condition based on their population cohort. Now, the amendment was extensive, and it was a balance between, do I want to worry about that much prosecution history estoppel, or do I want to see if I can show some good faith and a willingness to work with the examiner? I interviewed the examiner twice, and in the interim discovered this examiner was one of the reddest of the red examiners, and he even opened the interview by saying, I don't know why we're bothering with the call because I virtually never allow these. And I said, well, this will be interesting because I virtually never lose one. So we'll just see what we can do here. Amendment led to a request by the examiner for an interview, which I found very interesting and a wonderful sign. And during that interview, the examiner and I hashed out and had a wonderful negotiation that accepted the clarified claim language. We fine-tuned some of the processor-based amendments, and most of that extensive amendment that I initially thought would be necessary fulfilled one of its purposes. It showed good faith and willingness to work with an otherwise very difficult examiner. And we ended up with claims that I think were far better than what the client was expecting based on the prior prosecution.
That's a great story, because I do think examiner, because over years, I've got a chance to meet a lot of examiners, and I think a lot of attorneys around the country obviously don't get the opportunity that I've had over the years to meet current, former examiners, and maybe you haven't had a chance to work with many examiners or any examiners at the times, and they don't realize just how attorneys walk all over examiners, how they treat examiners, some of them treat examiners almost like they're subhuman, and how they always are trying to get one over on examiners, so if that's an examiner's view of what you're trying to do, you can't imagine how they're going to react to you. So to some extent, for better or for worse, I think a immediate threshold is to exude reasonableness. I'm not trying to pull one over on you. So I think that's a great story for a whole lot of reasons.
Well, I enjoyed the experience, and I have to note that the second call with the examiner was wonderfully productive, efficient, and very, very different in tone. I now know what this examiner is looking for. I have found what I think of as this examiner's reasonableness threshold. And in light of what's going on, we got better claims than we might have expected. But the examiner was willing to listen to the processor and user interface-based claims and hear me out. And that's how we got there.
That's excellent. Aparna, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there have been times when I've gotten that first office action gotten, an office action, and I said, oh wow, this examiner is going to be a hard one. I'm going to have to work real hard here to get them to see my point of view. But picking up the phone, giving them a call, having that examiner interview, first, I think humanizes you and them, and allows you to have a conversation with them. And as long as you treat them properly, that I've always found that they try to work with you. There are examiners that have a hard line. They are those red examiners that really stick to their guns. But at the end of the day, if you're open to the negotiation, you can typically bring them around as well.
Yeah, and I'll say from a statistical perspective, if you look at the allowance rate of an examiner in cases that have interviews versus allowance rate in cases that don't, it's always going to be higher, always. And the difference varies, right? Like sometimes the effect of an interview is greater than other times. And I will say that with red examiners, typically interviews are a little bit less effective. They tend to stick to their guns a little bit more, even if you talk to them. With green examiners, sometimes you see a greater differential, meaning that the interview seems to have more of an impact. But
Megan, I'm always amazed though. You look at the number of interviews that are conducted with the information that the PTO they put out every year, and we've been saying this for how many years that there is a delta. It is a delta that happens every year, and the delta is more than just here's a couple cases. There is a meaningful delta across the entire office, all art units, all examiner types. Interviews matter. And yet there's not even, it's not even one interview per application that's filed. I mean, it's not even close. It's like what, 20% of applications have one interview or less, right? So it's like some ridiculously low number, even though we know interviews matter. And we talk to attorneys like Roberta and Aparna, and they tell us interviews work, and over and over again, we hear that over and over again.
I don't know.
I don't know what to do sometimes. It's
Once they allow
is
interviews
this
via
microphone on? Hello, testing. Can you hear me?
Once they allow interviews via texting, maybe it'll be okay.
What's that?
There's some reluctance to pick up the phone.
Yeah. Well, no, that's the funny thing. It's like you can not have to get in touch with anybody. I mean, you don't have to be in person. You don't have to worry about wearing a mask or showing a vaccination card or anything. Just pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Oh wow. All right. So we're into almost into the final 2-minute warning here, but I'd like to give all of you an opportunity to respond to what we've done here so far here today, and give us your final thoughts, your takeaway message, what it is that you hope everybody here today leaves remembering. So let's start with you, Roberta. What is it that you hope everybody leaves today remembering, and maybe will hopefully implement into their own practice? Maybe those two questions, maybe it's the same question. What are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are these, Jean. First off, I want everybody to remember, when you get one of these now monstrously long rejections that seem rather daunting, take a deep breath and read it. Know there's a way forward. Second, remember that you yourself can provide that way forward by drafting a good specification that focuses intently on the technology, remembering to take a little bit of a visionary approach and give yourself that material to work with in the future. You may not need it now, but you might need it later.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Aparna, your final message today, your takeaway message, whether it's something you hope people remember, or maybe something that you hope that they do implement into their practice.
What I want to say is, the case law is changing. It's constantly changing. Things are up in the air right now with both of these Section 101 and Section 112. That is not to say, though, that we can't get claims allowed. I'll just echo what Roberta said. As you're drafting new applications, as you're going through prosecution, keep that case law in mind. Keep, hope that, with the new drafting techniques that we have, you should be able to get some allowable claims. I will say, though, that, as you're drafting, broad genus claims are, probably not going to be able to get through the people in the black robes, as you said, Jean. You need to have some backups in there, have some specific limitations in your claim, and make sure that you focus on the technical advances and call your examiner.
Yes, call the examiner. Excellent advice. Thank you so much. Megan, your final thought.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so I would say remember the human component of prosecution. At the end of the day, it's a person that you're talking to. And we now know straight from Drew Hirschfeld that there isn't a computer program that's analyzing your application to see if there are errors. This is a person responding to their situation, their environment, the guidelines that they've been given. And that comes through in the data when you see that different types of examiners respond differently. Some examiners are increasing the length of their office action significantly more than others. So know who your examiner is, both from the statistics from what they've done in the past, and get on the phone so you can know them as a person.
That's great advice. Well, thank you, ladies, very much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here in the audience today. We look forward to having you join us again, but that's all we have here for today, and hope to see you soon. Bye for now, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.